in the opening of Studies in the Textual Criticism of the New Testament, Bart Ehrman says, and this is talking about, let's deal now with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We'll leave Paul alone for a little while. We might get to him, we might not. Paul is a whole nother ball of wax altogether, man. When it comes to the Gospels, and even some of the books of Paul, he says, Bart Ehrman says that none of the autographs of the New Testament writings survive. None of the autographs of the New Testament writings survives. What does this mean? There are no originals. There are no originals. And no one ever put their name to a book that is authored in the New Testament. No one said, this is my book, I wrote this. We do not know who wrote Matthew. We do not know who wrote Mark. We do not know who wrote Luke. We do not know who wrote John. There are people who will try to hold on to this fact that they will say for sure that there are evidences that Matthew and Mark and Luke and John wrote these things, but there's so much overwhelming evidence to the contrary that only people who have blinded themselves can see this. Because even in Matthew, if Matthew wrote Matthew, he wrote in a way that no one of his time wrote, because he wrote the whole book in third person then, referring to himself as he and him. This was not the prose of anyway, this is not an eyewitness testimony. You do not say, I'm going to write an eyewitness account and refer to yourself in the third person. This is not credible, because then you put some type of if I'm going to say, write down a document that I want to be a witness to an event, I cannot use the third person. I cannot use the third person, because now I automatically put scrutiny on who wrote the book, especially if I don't put my name on it and I refer to myself as he and him. If I want to write an eyewitness account, I have to use the personal pronoun I or we. You understand where I'm getting at? And this is not what we find in these documents of the New Testament. And it says, the text of these works must therefore be reconstructed on the basis of surviving evidence. When it comes to reconstructing the New Testament, it has to be done on the basis of surviving evidences, which are the Greek manuscripts that we have, which are which were produced in later centuries. These are none of them traced back to the time around Jesus, nor the time around Jesus' disciples. The earliest, we think that the earliest book, most scholars are in agreement that the earliest book of the New Testament is Mark, and it was written in around 60 AD, which means after Jesus is gone. We use the word CE. And this is what I like about Bart Ehrman, is that he, even when he refers to things, he puts CE. This tells his belief, because it's AD means year of our Lord. CE means Christian era. So about 60 CE is when the first Mark was written. But the oldest existing copies we have are hundreds of years after that. Hundreds and hundreds of years after that are the oldest existing copies that we have. But this is, and the latest book was John, and we think that was probably around 85, between 85 and 90 CE, after Jesus is gone off the scene. So they cannot be eyewitness accounts written this much later, but anyway. So we have the existing evidences are three. These are the existing evidences in the New Testament. The Greek manuscripts that were written in later centuries, copies of ancient translations into other languages. These are people who took old manuscripts, like they were written in original languages, and then copied them over to other languages, which is what we have, like Latin and Syriac. These are documents we have in Latin and Syriac. One of the most famous one being the Codex Sinaiticus, which is written in Latin. But those aren't given as much weight. They're not really as weighty. Some of them have some weight, but the science behind that is too much to give you. And quotations from the New Testament by the early church fathers. When reading their writings, you know, they would make quotations, like the scholars would make quotations of the Quran. The scholars of Christianity will make quotations of the New Testament. So that we do know that they were reading at those times, like Eusebius was one of the first generation scholars. So when he writes something that he was reading in his time, we know that if we have that later, then we know that those two things agree. Yes, this has existed since this time. Even though there may be no evidence of it textually, we have quotations of it from the church fathers. So this is how they go about it in getting these things together.
We're not questioning Moses, but what was written was not written by Moses. If he had signed his name, no problem. If Jesus had countersigned Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there would have been no problem. But since Jesus didn't write a word, in his lifetime not a word was written. He didn't write it, nor did anybody write a word in his lifetime. These are all books, anonymous books. And the Christian scholars are telling us they have no ulterior motives. I might have, but not your scholars. What ulterior motive do they have to tell you that Matthew has used Mark's gospel freely? In the language of the school teacher, he was copying wholesale from Mark. And Mark was not even one of the 12 disciples of Jesus. Why should an eyewitness and a ear witness like Matthew go and copy somebody who wasn't there? It doesn't make sense. And in the book itself, Matthew tells us, Matthew 9:9, it says, while he, Jesus, was going forth into the way, Jesus, saw a tax collector called Matthew. And he, Jesus, comes up to him and he says to Matthew, follow me. And Matthew, followed him, Jesus. Who wrote that? God write it? Did Jesus write it? No. Did Matthew write it? No. Yes. If Matthew wrote it, he would say, while he was going forth into the way, he saw me at the tax collector's table, and he came up to me and told me to follow him, and I followed him. This is written by somebody else.
بل نقذف بالحق على الباطل فيدمغه فإذا هو زاهق ولكم الويل مما تصفون.